Hello and welcome to the Lively Faith Podcast. I am your host, the Reverend Nathan Stomberg, and today I'm joined by my co-host, the Reverend Mark Galloway. Before we get started, just a friendly reminder, have you received your free copy of the Lively Faith magazine yet? This is a cross-denominational effort for Christians who share a love for the common prayer tradition. It contains excellent devotionals rooted in the common prayer tradition, which explore the intersection of how church teaching informs Christians to interact with culture. So if you haven't already, please sign up for your free copy. We send them seasonally at livelyfaithministries.org. There you can sign up for our mailing list, and we really encourage you to do so. This is a labor of love and something that we are very excited to share. The Lively Faith magazine, sign up at livelyfaithministries.org. Click on magazine to sign up. All right, Mark, so we're getting into it today. There's no shortage of things to talk about, as always, and things have been very busy this recent season, and there are a few topics we've discussed before, but I'd like to return back to them because they're always so timely. We want to start here. We're going to discuss some topics pertaining to the Anglican Church and to Western civilization. And in previous episodes, I think, in particular in our immigration episode, we talked about open borders and just the vast transformation that Europe is undergoing right now because of their near open border policies, allowing unvetted, undocumented immigrants across into their countries who do not share any common values or traditions with what has typically undergirded the West. And so you're seeing riots, especially with the rise of a populist right, in backlash against the crime and the chaos that has ensued here. We've got some other articles that we'll get into as well with the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe that we're seeing as well. But that's really the introduction for us here. Your thoughts on Calvin Robinson's move off the bat?
Well, it's interesting how time proves points. Just this particular interview, I think, was September with Calvin Robinson. So,
yep.
And I think Election Day in America, he answered Calvin's question.
Yes.
Or, his statement or his point. Just don't sit back. And I think both Donald Trump's victory and the way the American populace voted in this election is about as major a statement as you can have in modern politics.
Yeah.
I don't. The days of the Ronald Reagan types landslides are never going to happen.
Never.
Ever again. So this is about as big a victory as you can get. As we were talking off the air, it's really a bigger victory than it even shows because of miscalculations in the census.
Yep.
So it's really even probably in 15 to 20 electoral college bigger victory than
right.
312. So I think our experience, I'm sure for most of our listening audience, of the current administration, the last nearly 4 years, the lack of common sense.
Yes.
In American public life is just, I think, in flyover country, people just said enough of
right.
this. And England is just such a mess. And interestingly, while Trump gets reelected, and in 7 days of Trump's reelection to the presidency, the world's already changed.
Yeah, it was remarkable how quickly the world responded to just his election. He hasn't even taken office yet, which tells you the degree to which there was a leadership vacuum created by the prior administration.
What's interesting is that, but England went with the Labour government, right?
Right.
And that they, for the Labour Party and its coalition, the re-election of Trump's the worst thing in the world.
Yeah. And I think that, not to turn this into a specifically political podcast, but that speaks to, I think it relates to what we're going to talk about, but that speaks to the failures of the Conservatives, the Tory party in the UK over the last decade plus to, really failing to be a true conservative party.
As the rhinos were in America for 30
And
years.
as we're going to explore later, lukewarm Christians, especially in the Anglican Church. But to your point, to really color and direct our conversation here, I was reminded once again, as we often are, of C.S. Lewis and his book, The Abolition of Man, where he writes about men without chests. And as I've preached and written about much lately, the church needs men with chests, and the West needs Christians with chests. The West needs a muscular Christianity. You don't just sit back into the lukewarm bathwater and let the cultural change happen to you.
Right. Just for kicks on the way up here, I looked up on Wikipedia, and of course, Wikipedia constantly refers to him as the alt-right guy all through the whole article, right? It's just like this complete bashing of him in his, and it's, wouldn't be the case, obviously, somebody far on the left, but everything that Calvin's been saying going on, and fighting for in England, is true. And, but they expect, because he's biracial, that he's expected to toe the line and be a liberal, just as in America with this election here, right? Former President Obama, if you're not, if you're a black man, you have to think this way, you have to vote this way. And those things are, they're un-Christian, they're certainly un-American to think that way. And it's just leads more to this division and this hatred in culture.
Right. As to muscular Christianity, as we're calling it, it's not like a superficial masculinity, but it's an inherently masculine strength that is especially required of the church's men, and that courage is contagious. So it only takes a few bold, brave men to stand up for what they believe in to really start a movement. And like you said, you've seen it just with the popular reaction to Father Calvin online, not just in Anglican circles, but especially in Catholic circles as well. So I think that's something that really inspires me in what we're doing here. I think to add an additional dimension to it, of course, he's moved around between denominations a lot, and so I think there's also something to be learned here, not to pick on him superficially, but of course, with converts, even within a denomination, the new place that you fall always happens to be totally pure and without fault, and you can see that come through in the piece that he wrote on his Substack about joining this new place in Michigan.
Yes. Calvin's been in, frontline news for 5 or 6 years, and he's very articulate. He's a smart guy. He's not a particularly learned theologian. He only has 2 years he went to St. Stephen's House for 2 years of study, which is just basic introductory theology. And so Calvin has written some stuff that I think he puts himself in a corner a few times on some stuff, and he has a stylized version of history that isn't particularly accurate all the time, but I don't think that...
No, absolutely not.
So we'll see. Eventually, you'll stop being a media star.
Right.
And being the life of a priest will settle down, and his life will change. And But I'm very grateful for him. There's no American version of him.
No, there really isn't. Actually, it's a really good point. As far as, not that we want to invest or put too much weight in Christian celebrity, let's call it,
right?
Because that's never a good thing. But in terms of just, we'll call it star power, for lack of a better term, Christian star power. there really is no conservative Christian on the American scene that I can think of. And it used to reside very much, or at least in the last decade and a half, in the evangelical side of things. And we're seeing now, especially with David Platt, for example, we watched that documentary on what's happened there with his church. The evangelical mega pastors are all falling by the wayside.
Yeah, and they're bailing on the paramount issues of our time, right? Really, it's not really possible to have. I mean, the closest thing we've had is Billy Graham on the evangelical side, where he was America's pastor. There'll never ever be another person that will have the status and the esteem of Dr. Graham. And on the Catholic side, it's been since Fulton Sheen had that type of clout and influence across the culture. So, I mean, Fulton Sheen has been dead since 1979. But in England it's different. And the reason why Calvin Robinson jettisoned, because he was on the BBC, and he was, and in England there's a state church. And so, the bishops sit in the House of Lords. 20 of the bishops sit in the House of Lords. And it's an interesting fact. There's only 2 governments in the world where clerics have a place in the parliamentary discussion: England and Iran.
It's fascinating.
It is. Just one of those trivia things.
Fun fact.
But so that's why in England you have these. A cleric, can have such influence, and for good or ill, left or right. But that's not. America's not. We're not designed that way. Thank God, we're not. And so it's much more difficult to. I think it's impossible for a single. I think the closest, probably, in evangelical side, is our friend Dr. Moeller. Yeah.
But I think the trend that I've seen, and in no small part because of what we do here with Lively Faith, is with the more traditionalist resurgence within the church. You're seeing more, maybe grassroots, but smaller sort of, not celebrities, but smaller figures gaining popularity in the online space. Ours, Lively Faith Ministries, would be pretty small by comparison, but you look at Calvin Robinson. Obviously, you've got guys on the Catholic side. We talk a lot about Frad and Pites with Aquinas, for example. Catholic Answers obviously has a pretty big audience with people like Trent Horn. But then even in Anglican circles, we're pretty small but growing by God's grace. You've got people like Young Anglican. There's really a constellation of smaller ministries and channels like ours and like his. Throughout the YouTube space, and then even on the Protestant side, you've got the Reconquista guy there. I'm drawing a blank on his name. Well, anyway, it'll come back to me. But all that to say is, there's no really one big figurehead, but there is a groundswell of traditionalist and more conservative Christian support that is growing among younger generations, especially people my age.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely accurate. And there's a cross-fertilization, for instance, your generation on the Catholic side.
Yeah.
And you see this with the different Catholic podcasts, whether they're great defenders of the Pope or they're critics of the Pope, right? And your generation would be more critical.
Yep.
And the Pope's plainers. So there's like this kind of civil war going on in Catholic podcasting.
Yeah.
Right. That isn't so much happening. It's pretty much a homogenous message, I think, with your generation across some of the denominational lines because really it's really about human anthropology, Christian anthropology, freedom of speech, right? Freedom of religion. So, and it doesn't have the Catholic complexities that come into these conversations. And so it's some of your, certainly much more staunch evangelical equivalents on the internet, and if you got into the weeds of theology, you wouldn't be agreeing on a lot of things.
Right. Really, the agreement, if you're talking about across traditions, comes back to like issues of natural law, and responding to cultural rebellion against that. One of the points that I wanted to make, I think that's a good teaching point that relates to Calvin and Robinson's move and the concerning trends that we're seeing across the West, has to do, going back again, no church tradition is perfect, right? So when Father Calvin speaks of the Anglican Catholic Church, obviously you can see the affection for this tradition come through. And we've seen with other friends and people we know, as when people switch or become converts from one religion to another. Rod Dreher is an excellent example, convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, and after you convert, singing its praises, and what else could be better, right? But I think there's very often a coming back to earth as you get more involved with the church, especially at the local level, and you get involved in the weeds there, that there really is no perfect place. And when you're looking for that utopia, you're never going to find it on this side of heaven. But I think that the takeaway for us, right, connected to this, let's call it a decline in Western civilization, a falling away of cultural Christianity, the church itself, as we've witnessed over the last few years, is becoming increasingly fractured over issues of natural law. And as we are going through, and as many of our friends and listeners are going through right now, the process of finding a new church home and rebuilding what your local Christian life looks like as we are navigating, we'll call it the ruins of cultural Christianity, is going to be very difficult, but it's very important throughout that journey to realize that there is no perfect place. And so you really have to go back to, are we adhering to biblical orthodoxy and to the historic teachings of the church, and understanding what those ancillary issues are, and not becoming disheartened when the picture of your own church life does not perfectly match what you think it was supposed to look like based on 30, 40 years ago.
Right. I was talking to an evangelical pastor earlier this year, and the fraying of, like you were saying, some of these mega pastors and mega churches and so forth, and they become soft in the sexuality issues, and the battle in the Southern Baptist Convention over the ordination of women and so forth and so on, is that because so much of evangelicalism is so rooted almost in congregational experience, such a local experience, right? Christology can be really bad.
Yeah.
And you can see this with your generation. I see these young pastors and minds, they're rediscovering Orthodox Christology and the complexity of how we got to Orthodoxy. Right. And I think that's a really good thing.
Yeah.
And so it moves the church away from the cult of personality with evangelical congregations. And so it's not about, trying to be the greatest preacher in the history of the world and like dominate, and all about numbers and clicks and all this other stuff, but it's about sharing the truth, rooted in these things that go way before anything, of American evangelicalism after the Civil War. And I think that's an awesome thing.
Yeah.
So, but it's almost happening unconsciously, I think, too.
Yeah.
In many ways.
Yeah, I think in large part, we say very often that reality always wins, and so you've got natural law comes through, and the reality of that, again, God's creation shines through, and that I think that prompts this generation to wonder, what else are we missing in the church, and then going back to for instance, those old paths.
Well, if you really can have a true intellectually honest conversation with an evangelical brother about what happened at Nicaea, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Chalcedon, right? Now you can have a conversation about what Mary's role is in the history of the church, because you can't get to the Christology that is Orthodox, that the Reformation inherited from 1,000 years of work of the church in Eastern and Western expressions. And so it's invaluable that these things, it's like hoeing your garden.
Yeah.
Getting it ready for a new planting. So it'll take a long time, but it's happening.
Yeah.
It'll take the rest of your life.
Yeah, and probably longer than that.
Yeah.
Easily.
Easily. Yep.
So switching gears a little bit, warning signs that we see in the UK and in Europe that I thought were relevant for us to look at. One was actually an article that you had shared with me recently by Rod Dreher, as a matter of fact, talking about Europe's Jews, canaries, and the civilizational coal mine. And the lead sentence of this here says, 20 years ago this month, it's written in November, a Dutch Islamist named Mohammed Biyari slaughtered filmmaker and prominent Islam critic Theo van Gogh in the streets of Amsterdam. The second-generation Dutch-born Moroccan shot the older provocateur several times. This man is now serving a life sentence, but he goes on to say that if you publicly criticized Islam, it wasn't safe for you to walk the streets of Amsterdam in 2004. But things have changed. There's been a reaction, but where Rod Dreher is going with this is there's recently been an increase in incidents of violence against Jews in Europe. I think largely have centered around soccer matches where Israel comes in, plays a national soccer game, and really what they become excuses for are pogroms against Jews, where especially in Amsterdam, you had this soccer match, and it results in an outbreak of violence.
Yeah.
And the soccer match concludes, but the violence still continues.
Right.
And now I believe Israel is planning a soccer match, national game against France, and France is way staffing up on their police because they're expecting similar violence to break out.
Yeah, it's crazy things. This has happened several times in the last several years, right? These Israeli women's soccer team and other teams, turn their back on them. They're singing the national anthem and all these things. And this soccer match this week, where the violence broke out while they were singing.
Yeah,
it's like unbelievable, right? How we haven't learned anything from the 20th century.
it's crazy.
It's
very
just,
short-term
it's
memories.
just incredible, right? That no population has been more persecuted in the modern era, right? And it's like we can't even get 70 years from the Second World War, and it's like and so men with chests, we have to speak up, and Calvin's done this too, right? And but there's a price to pay. I don't need to tell my story again, but you pay a price.
Yes.
Islam is not a religion of grace, and it is Sharia law is incompatible to the United States Constitution. It cannot be. You can't do it, right? So you can't have two different standards, which they're trying to do in England, and they've tried to do in other places, right? Certainly in France,
Yeah.
right? They just kind of mark off a zone, and Sharia law is allowed to exist here. And then they pretend they're a democracy and there's freedom of speech, right? But women can be, treated like chattel. So it's just, it's hard for people in our country today, even people, conservatives, to have enough courage to speak the truth. Because there's a consequence. You have to be willing to pay the price. That's what makes Trump such a revolutionary figure. And he's going to go down in history, having changed the course of human events. Because he doesn't care what you think, and what you see is what you get. And that was the great difference between he and his opponent in this election. I have no idea what she believes about anything, right? But at least you know where the guy stands, right?
Right.
And as we know, Peter says, he writes, let your yes be yes, let your no be no.
Yes.
Right?
That's hard to come by.
Oh
these
my
days.
gosh. I'm in my 31st year of ministry, and there wasn't a lot of them around 31 years ago, and there's a lot less of them now, right?
Yeah.
It's rare. Yeah, it's a rare bird that evangelicals in Rhode Island. There's no significant leader of evangelicals in Rhode Island. Do you know anybody evangelicals fighting abortion at major level?
Struggle to.
Or sexuality issues,
Right.
marriage, right? It's they're more, they're concerned about money, numbers, keeping their congregation alive, all these things that are secondary to preaching the gospel.
Yeah.
And
I think the message for us is, what we've fallen into is, especially among evangelicalism, like a lukewarm mode of Christianity that really tries it's syncretistic is what it is. It becomes like the culture around it. And people become so sensitive when talking about cultures that are foreign to the United States or the UK or the West more generally. And what we need to realize is that the church, yes, it transcends culture, that the church isn't made or suited specifically for one specific ethnicity, let's say, but it's not blind to culture either.
No,
and the church understands and rightly applied redeems culture, but the church throughout history has been wise to recognize that there are certain cultures, such as Islam, that are totally incompatible, and in the case of Islam, a false religion. So, but if the church doesn't have the guts to come out and say those things, then she, at least in her current form, is not going to exist the way that she does for very long. Not that the church will be defeated, but it's going to transform, and the cultural Christians are going to fall by the wayside.
yes, there's nothing. I think the Church of England,
Right.
with Calvin, it has nothing to offer the culture. The whole point of the state church was that it was a Christian country,
Right.
and the Parliament was the functioning partner with the church in keeping the country rooted in its Christian civilization and its history, and now it's opposed to everything about that.
Yeah.
Right, because it's opposed to everything about natural law, and it's other than progressive social issues, it doesn't have anything to talk about.
And so one of the things we also wanted to discuss here was the recent developments with Justin Welby. He recently resigned his post. I don't know if you have, actually it might be one of those articles printed out over there, but the fall of Archbishop Welby, written by Carl Trueman on First Things. But as some of our listeners may be aware, Archbishop Welby, early in November, resigned from his position due to mishandling of a sex abuse scandal within the church. And really the bottom line is he wasn't directly implicated, but the report that was released indicated that he may have had knowledge of what was going on and did not take adequate action in order to address it. And so Carl Trueman writes an excellent article summarizing that, but really the punchline that he comes to is, it is an indication of all you need to know about the priorities of the church over the last however many decades, that he's pointlessly presided over these other issues and distorted biblical teaching for so long that this issue of grave importance did not get addressed because they were distracted with issues of appeasing sexual revolutionaries.
The notion, it's impossible for me to believe that Welby didn't know about all of this. even first of all, Welby grew up and knew this guy. He went to the camps he grew up in the evangelical camps. That's what Welby was. He grew up in the evangelical wing of the church, and these abuses it's impossible for him to believe. Not only did he not know about it before he became Archbishop in 2013, he certainly would have been informed about it when he became the Archbishop of Canterbury. And he made the choice not to address it. Right. Now, at the same time, which just goes up my backside, Bishop Bell,
they pontificated for
Bishop of Chichester, who's on the calendar of saints
Yep.
in the Anglican Communion, an allegation that comes out 50 years after his death, with no substantial proof whatsoever, and he just eviscerated.
Yeah.
Bell eviscerated.
Yeah.
He took down his statue in front of Chichester Cathedral, right, and then as the investigation went on and so forth, and it really found out it was bogus. But Bell has not been rejuvenated, and Welby's never really apologized. But at the same time, he knew for 40 years about this situation, in my opinion, and it wasn't worth it. He wasn't going to do it because it would
didn't want to risk the image to the church.
All of the things, right? And this is the same guy. Welby. His greatest sin is that he hasn't defended the gospel as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And so God doesn't care about titles. It doesn't matter you're Archbishop of Canterbury. He's shown me nothing that he was willing to defend the gospel. But he's willing to speak about every political issue. He's been the most politically active archbishop in my lifetime. And he's just eviscerates the political right. He associates if you don't believe in his version of global warming, he calls you a Nazi. If you were for Brexit, he called you a fascist. Right? It's like that's not the role of a pastor. It's not the role of the leader of a national church and an international communion.
Not at all.
He's an utter disaster.
Not to mention, he can no longer articulate what a sin is, right? He was in the headlines a month prior, in October, I think it was, for he did an interview, a follow-up interview with a podcast that he was doing, again, on the nature of, is gay sex sinful? And he couldn't condemn it. He said, it's fine as long as it's within a faithful relationship.
Yeah, he dispersed it out. Yeah. It's like, he says himself and the Archbishop of York, but he admitted not all the bishops agree with them that committed relationships that's completely unbiblical, right? It's completely there's no theology for it.
Show me where St. Paul wrote about that.
Right, it's nowhere in the tradition of the church. It's against natural law, right? It's incredible, right? It disqualifies you to have a legitimate voice as a Christian pastor. If it's just two horrific archbishops in a row. Rowan Williams didn't defend. Rowan Williams is a great intellect, but he let the canary and he let the worms out of the can on all these social issues, and it just has devastated the Church of England to death. It's a dead institution. It's divided the Anglican world into splinter pieces, and
we can only pray for Welby's replacement, but I don't have great confidence
I think it's irrelevant.
It's right, and I think it's even with a strong replacement, the Anglican Communion is too far fractured to be able to restore any unity there.
The Bishop of he's not one of the major C's. I'm trying to remember. He's a younger guy. He's only been bishop since 2019. He seems to be on the short list, but there's going to be massive pressure to make the woman Bishop of London the
Right.
Archbishop of Canterbury. And that's just put all the nails in the coffin if that happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. Complete, terrible, right? Nothing orthodox about that person.
Not
Nothing.
at all.
So, but the Welby thing is the devastation it does to the witness of the church and the culture. Right? Like in England, you're the state church, right? And so you're spewing all this stuff, progressive stuff, and chastising half the country's political views, right? And you're supposed to be the chief pastor of the country, but at the same time, you cover up sexual abuse, right? Pedophilia and massive physical abuse.
Yeah,
to
yeah.
the kid.
Responsible for at
Beating-
least one death.
Oh,
this guy,
absolutely.
Smith.
And you're supposed to have legitimacy as a state church to speak into the culture about the moral principles of historic Christianity. Forget it.
Yeah.
Forget it. The church. I wouldn't listen to the church either.
No.
Right? And so it's like the whole main line in America, right? They have nothing to offer the culture, zero to offer the culture, nothing. They have no message because there's no sin. You don't need a gospel. You don't need the cross. You don't need Jesus, right?
No, it's a bad social club. What am I going to go hang out with a bunch of old people and play the acoustic
Right.
guitar?
It's universalism, right? And so and your generation is the generation that says, as Calvin Robinson says, as far as here I stand,
Yeah.
here I stand, and that's as far as I go. And thank God that there's this remnant in your generation that's
God for that.
going to rise, and they have arisen. And it's shameful. This is shameful. Yeah, I could go on. I mean, I have never been a fan of the man, but this just solidifies my
Yeah.
my disgust with 30 years in Anglican ministry. You could go back a long ways when you had an archbishop preaching the gospel, George Carey, who hasn't he hasn't been in office for 21 years. That's a long time.
Wow.
But yeah, the victims, the families. You're talking these guys are dying. These kids. This happened 50 years ago.
Yeah.
A lot of these people are dead, and how progressive thinks the world would want to listen to our message is beyond me. They should be in sackcloth and ashes.
Really should.
But that's not going to happen.
No.
The labor government and the establishment
Right.
is going to close ranks and do what they always do, and change the subject and talk about global warming and blah 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 blah
Yep.
blah blah blah.
Complain about American politics.
Oh yes, right. They'll just plug it in with Trump
Yep.
and the horrific direction that America didn't go.
Yeah.
Right? And it says a lot about our political system. I was talking to a joint friend of ours Wednesday at lunch, and the republic worked. There's a self-correction that happens in the American Republic.
Yeah.
And we seem to be right on the edge of the abyss, and it corrects itself. Civil War, right?
That's nothing new.
No, it's not, right? Civil rights. But cracks happen. It's like the Liberty Bell, but it still rings. It still rings, right? And that's what true democracy, a true republic is able to do. It self-corrects. And I think we're going to see the largest self-correction in American history since the Civil War. Coming because the person is president has nothing to lose,
That's absolutely right.
and he owes nobody anything, right? It never has politically. And so I think we're actually going to begin to actually reverse the inevitable bankruptcy of our literal financial bankruptcy of our country and all these other things that have just been ignored, kicking the can down the road.
God willing.
Generation after generation, right? And but we'll see. But it's so interesting what England and America and how often they're in different places, even though they're the closest allies of each other, right? You had Tony Blair's government when you had George Bush's government, right? And you see, it's always interesting. They can be in completely polar opposite places and the political spectrum at any given time in history.
Right.
You know, FDR and Winston Churchill. One's a conservative and one's a liberal.
Yeah.
Right. So it's nothing new to history.
Reagan Thatcher was really something of an anomaly.
Totally. Right. Yep. And they're both looked upon negatively by current historians.
Yeah.
Right. I guess when Margaret Thatcher never lost an election, right? Prime Minister for 11 years. And of course, Ronald Reagan won 49 states. I mean, somebody must have liked him at one point.
Yeah, right? Yeah. There must have been a few people who were fans of him back then. Right. So I think to put a bow on that, a program that I enjoyed listening to, Conversations That Matter, with John Harris. He's really like the I'd call him like the Protestant analog to what we're doing here. There's a lot of really fascinating conversations about the intersection of culture, but from the evangelical side. So he really represents kind of the groundswell of opposition to like big evangelical celebrity culture. And in discussing the outcome of the election, you really framed it as, God granting his people in America a reprieve from the cultural oppression that we've so often experienced. And his charge to his listeners was, let's say you've got 4 years, you've got a chance to catch your breath. Don't waste that time.
Oh,
you have to take it to God in prayer and think about what you're going to do with these next 4 years, because there's no guarantee what's going to come after that. So whether that's what you're going to, but really what it comes down to is just what Calvin Robinson is doing. He's saying enough is enough, and integrating with your local church. And if you don't have a church community, moving somewhere where you can find that community. And
right.
That's what it's going to take to
don't
rebuild.
Live in the past.
Right, and don't live in the past. Look ahead to the future and understand that the church looks different and it's going to look very different. And this reprieve is going to be your chance to take part in rebuilding what the church is going to look like in the future in the United States.
I think historically speaking, and again, it's hard when we so much politics, quote, gets brought into conversation, but freedom of speech and freedom of religion were at stake.
Yes.
In my opinion, in this election, like never before in American history, right? And the fact that the richest man in the world bought Twitter might have saved freedom of speech.
Yeah, the joke is it all comes down to Babylon Bee making one joke and getting banned that Elon Musk didn't take kindly to.
Right. And I don't want to make this a literal parallel, but it does have a feeling like it's Cyrus.
Yeah,
right?
I've thought the same thing.
I mean, God uses a Zoroastrian pagan to free the chosen people who literally lost the Torah.
Yeah.
Right? And it's him who allows, this pagan king who allows them to go back and rebuild the temple, rediscover the law. And I am under no delusion that Donald Trump is some Christian saint, right? Or I'm not even sure he's Christian. I think he I think he plays the fence pretty good. I don't know if he's committed his life to Christ ever or not. But God uses crooked lines to make his will be done in the course of history, and this will be fascinating 100 years from now how history.
Yeah, looking back,
how they write history. We'll see.
Yeah.
But I agree. The time for action is right now. It's every day, every minute of every day, not waiting and assuming you're going to get, whatever the next political messiah.
Don't just sit back. Donald, we said in our election episode, Trump isn't going to solve all your problems if you're a Christian.
A president doesn't even have that much power.
No,
they're not a king.
No.
It's quite frankly, the cult of Trump can be scary, in my opinion, from a Christian perspective.
Oh, that's very, very problematic.
Yes, and that a president is that he's checked and balanced in his authority in the country. He's not a king, and people lose sight of that until they have this idea that the president has this massive influence on the economy. I'm like, no, he doesn't.
Right.
Right. Congress does.
Yeah.
Congress spends the money. Right. Congress allots the money, and the president's main goal is to defend the country's safety, and he's the chief military officer of the country, right? So, there's just all these massive misconceptions constitutionally and socially and culturally about who the president is, right? And that's not healthy.
No, it certainly is not.
Yeah, and it's and again, it just distorts history, and it makes I've taught several civics courses, and I leave my head wanting to bash my head against.
Spitting.
Yeah, it's like, and these are the good people, right, coming to the courses, and the things they believe, and they think are actually in the Constitution and are a part of jurisprudence in America. And I'm like, no, right? And I think so many Christians, evangelicals and Catholics, fall into this and just perpetuate it from generation to generation. And that's, it's, again, I think it's another thing we have to be truthful about.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of places around pulpits that are going to be, in the last 2 weeks have talked about, this is the hand of God, and it's like, let's put this in perspective.
Yep.
Right. So.
Yeah, take the foot off the gas for a minute. And one of the things we've warned about before is to guard against the temptation to take what the Republican Party platform is, and then backfilling that to say that's the Christian conservative position. Like we were talking about off air before the episode, it's really no longer a conservative party per se. It's a populist party, and on the one hand, that's why it's become so diverse, is because it's broadened out on a wider range of issues. But from a Christian pro-life perspective, is troubling.
That platform is terrible.
But and really, where the unity comes from is a reaction to the rebellion against natural law.
Yes.
But there's a permissiveness with the moral law, which is why you don't. There's obviously not a mum about things like abortion, or there's the tragic stance that it's taken on abortion, just as one example, or IVF for contraceptive, and
right.
Even going all the way back to issues of divorce. Is there's no moral conviction, so to speak.
No person, I think, sums it up more than about this divide in America and what this election was about than Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Here's a guy, he's a Kennedy.
Yeah.
Right? And because he ran, and the Democratic Party didn't want him in the primaries, right? So he was unceremoniously dumped out. So he becomes an independent. His family disowns him, right? He ends up dropping out, endorsing Trump. Now Kennedy is going to be in a Republican administration. I thought I'd see the second coming, seriously, before that would ever happen. But here's the thing we have to be, as Christians, with Kennedy, Tulsi Gabbard, others, right? Kennedy has horrific views on life issues.
Yeah, he's got a terrible record.
Right. So he's an anti-vaxxer, so that's going to make a lot of people in our audience happy. Not everybody, right? So it is this populism.
Yeah.
It's like which leads to often the most watered down position you can get to keep a coalition together. Right. So I hear about this super team and all these things. The
Avengers.
We'll see if they're a super team, right? I like lots of things about Tulsi Gabbard, but she's wrong about the issues of life, right? If you're wrong about anthropology, you're wrong about Christian origin, life's origin, you're going to be wrong about a bunch of other things too. So I hope our audience, and I hope Orthodox Christians, biblical believers, are keeping all of these things in mind. If they think this is the second, this is the 12 apostles sitting on the thrones, right, judging the nations, right? They're not, right? And it'll be like every other government, all right? They'll do a lot of things we like, I think,
and they'll do some things that you don't.
Right. And one thing about Donald Trump, he's consistently inconsistent. Look at his picks, right?
Yeah.
You're just like, that's the thing. You get what you get with him, right? You're going, what?
Yeah.
And you just other pick, you're like, and
you're
like,
what are you doing?
Out of 330 million people, that's the person you picked for that,
yeah.
right? That's right. You got to be able to deal with it. But again, you have to be able to deal with facts and truth to be able to have the conversation.
Yeah. Yep. You've got to be open to being intellectually honest and thinking through these issues, as we always discuss. And you can't be afraid to. I mean, obviously, you don't want to be political for the sake of being political, but you also can't be afraid of being labeled political, as you and I are both familiar with, because the issues that we discuss are pre-political, and politics is downstream of culture, as we've discussed time and again. And so if you're going to be talking about issues of life, matters of Christian anthropology, and issues that matter, ultimately you are going to wander into the realm of politics, as we have today, and there's no apologies for that. So really, to sum it all up,
those things aren't politics, they're the gospel.
Exactly.
It's the gospel.
Well, what I mean is, discussing,
I know exactly what you mean.
politicians, but the issues themselves are matters of gospel truth.
Well, you've had to listen to me drone on for 2 decades, and you've heard critiques of me. Don't bring politics. He brings politics into the issue, and I'm like, Christian marriage and abortion are not politics. It's just the gospel, right? This is what God said is true. And what you should expect of your bishop is that's what he's going to defend.
What the church has always taught.
Yeah, not appease you with what you want to hear, right? Your itching ears. And it's always been the battle of ministry, but it's been easier in some stretches of history than in others, I reckon. Yeah. So.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. I think to put it all in perspective here, Lively Faith Ministries is our humble work in order to play a part in not sitting back and actively engaging with other Christians and encouraging one another in the fight to defend the gospel to a hostile culture. So, if you like what we do, if you've enjoyed the podcast and you haven't already, please join us in that fight by subscribing either to the audio or on YouTube. And once again, our latest work, the Lively Faith magazine, yet another resource that we are proud to offer by God's grace to encourage one another in the fight to faithfully engage the culture. So we thank you so much, as always, for your continued prayers and your support. Your likes and your subscriptions go a long way to helping us grow this humble ministry. So once again, I am the Reverend Nathan Stomberg, and you have been listening to the Lively Faith Podcast. God bless.